Silas Boone only saw a broken saddle and a widow's desperate eyes in the Wyoming dust. He fixed it for free, moved by the silent child clinging to her skirts. Abigail Holt whispered of trouble chasing shadows, but neither expected her brothers to arrive by sundown, bearing a gift that would crack open Silas's buried past and rewrite both their futures in blood and gold. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches your heart, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've got something extra special saved just for you. The wind in Sage Bend wasn't a thing you heard. It was a thing you wore. It layered itself onto everything. The sun-bleached clabber of the livery stable, the creaking sign above Silas Boone's saddlery, the very skin of the man himself as he stood in the open doorway, squinting against the afternoon glare. Dust, fine and relentless as time, coated his worn leather apron, settled in the grooves of his knuckles, and tasted of grit and sage on his tongue. 1878 had etched itself onto Wyoming territory like a scar, and Sage Bend was just another knot in the suture line holding the wilderness at bay. Inside the low-roof saddlery, the air hung thick and still, smelling of oiled leather, pine pitch, and the dry, sweet tang of hay drifting from the attached stable. Sunlight speared through a single grimy window, illuminating motes dancing in the gloom. Silas ran a callous thumb along the edge of a stirrup strap. He was reinforcing. The leather was good, thick harness hide, responding to the careful bite of his awl and the steady pull of waxed thread. Work. It was the anchor, the thing that kept the silence from swallowing him whole. His gaze drifted, unseeing, over the tools hanging neatly on the wall. Sharp knives, blunt mallets, rolls of rawhide lace. Then it snagged, as it always did, on the small, round shape in his vest pocket. He didn't need to touch it to feel the cold silver of the pocket watch, the smooth curve of its casing worn thin by years of unconscious handling. 10 years. The weight hadn't lessened. It just settled deeper, a stone lodged beneath his ribs where laughter used to be. Collar took fast. It didn't care about promises, about a young wife's smile, or a toddler's sticky fingers reaching for a carved wooden horse. It just took, left a man standing in an empty cabin with a pocket watch ticking like a mocking heartbeat in a void. A sound intruded, not the wind sigh, nor the distant complaint of a mule from the corral. This was the uneven, labored stumble of a horse pushed too far. Silas lifted his head, the familiar creak of his neck bones loud in the quiet. Through the dust-hazed doorway, he saw a gaunt bay mare stumble to a halt, its head drooping, flanks heaving like bellows. A woman slid stiffly from its back, her movements brittle with exhaustion. She landed unsteadily, one hand gripping the saddle horn white-knuckled, the other immediately reaching back. A small child, a girl, scrambled down after her, landing lightly but clinging instantly to her mother's faded calico skirt, burying her face in the fabric. The woman, Abigail Holt, though Silas wouldn't know that yet, stood for a moment, swaying slightly, her chest rising and falling rapidly. Dust clung to her worn shawl like a second skin, matted her dark hair escaping a simple bun, and etched fine lines around her wide, shadowed eyes. Those eyes, a startlingly clear gray against the dust, swept the street, past the silent saloon, the shuttered mercantile, the empty boardwalk, with a haunted intensity that seemed out of place in the sleepy afternoon stillness of Sage Bend. She turned toward the saddlery, her gaze locking onto Silas framed in the doorway. For a heartbeat, pure, unvarnished fear flickered across her face, sharp as a knife point. Then it was gone, replaced by a mask of weary determination. She took a hesitant step forward, pulling the child gently along with her. The little girl, Tess, peeked out from behind the skirt. Her face was pale beneath the dust, dominated by enormous, watchful eyes that held none of a child's usual sparkle, only a profound, silent wariness. She clutched a limp rag doll, missing an arm. Abigail stopped a few paces short of the doorway, her posture rigid, shoulders squared as if bracing against a blow. "Sir," her voice was low, raspy, scraped raw by dust and fatigue. It held a tremor she couldn't quite suppress. I'm sorry to trouble you." She gestured weakly toward the bay mare. The saddle, a cheap, poorly maintained McClellan, sat crookedly. The critical girth strap, the wide band cinching the saddle to the horse's belly, was visibly frayed, the leather fibers separating like rotten rope. One section was worn perilously thin, strands snapping and curling outward. It gave way mostly back a ways, near through us. Can't go another mile like this. Her knuckles were white where she gripped the reins. Silas didn't move immediately. His eyes, a flinty blue beneath thick brows, assessed the situation with the detached pragmatism of years spent fixing broken things. The horse was spent. The saddle was junk. The woman was trembling on her feet. The child silent. Watchful stare unnerved him. It echoed a vulnerability he'd walled off a decade ago. He saw the frayed strap not just as leather, but as catastrophe waiting to happen. A sudden spook, a stumble, and that strap would snap. The rider would fall. The child, his jaw tightened. He gave a curt nod, stepping back from the doorway. "Bring her in. Shades better." His voice was gravel and used. Abigail flinched almost imperceptibly at the sound, then nodded, relief warring with a deep-seated tension in her eyes. She murmured soothingly to the mare, a sound more breath than word, and led the exhausted animal into the deep shade cast by the stable's overhang, just beside the saddler door. Tess followed like a small, silent shadow, her doll dangling. Silas approached the mare, his movements slow and deliberate, giving the skittish animal time to register him. He ran a hand down her sweat-streaked neck, feeling the tremor in her muscles, then expertly lifted the saddle flap. His fingers probed the frayed girth strap. It was worse than it looked. The leather wasn't just worn, it was rotten, crumbling slightly at the core. Gone, he stated flatly, straightening up. He wiped his hands on his apron. Needs a whole new strap. Hours' work. He saw the color drain further from Abigail's face. Her gaze darted past him, down the empty street leading east out of town. An hour? The words were a whisper, laced with panic. We need to be moving on, sir. Trouble might be catching up." She didn't elaborate, but the way her hand tightened on Tess's shoulder, the way her eyes scanned the horizon like a cornered animal, spoke louder than any explanation. Silas met her gaze. He'd seen that hunted look before, on men dodging debts, on families fleeing floodwaters, on survivors of things best left unnamed. The West bred trouble, like the wind bred dust. He didn't ask. His own ghosts were company enough. "Ride out on that strap," he said, his tone devoid of inflection. "You won't make the bend before it snaps. Then you're walking." He paused, letting the image settle. With the child. Abigail closed her eyes for a second. A tremor ran through her. She looked down at Tess, whose wide eyes stared back, unblinking. The silent communication between mother and daughter held a weight that pressed on the dusty air. When Abigail opened her eyes, defeat warred with fierce, protective light. "An hour," she breathed, the word barely audible. "All right," Silas grunted. He swiftly unbuckled the saddle, hefting its awkward weight. "Water canteen inside," he said, jerking his head toward the doorway. "For you and the girl." It wasn't hospitality, it was survival. The parched land demanded it. He carried the saddle into the dimness of the shop and laid it across his heavy workbench. Abigail hesitated, then guided Tess inside. The small space felt suddenly crowded, charged with their unspoken fear and exhaustion. Tess froze just inside the door, her eyes enormous as they scanned the unfamiliar tools, the hanging rolls of leather, the sharp smells. Abigail moved to the dented canteen hanging near the door, poured water into the chipped tin cup, and held it first to Tess's lips. The girl drank in small, bird-like sips, her gaze never leaving Silas as he worked. He ignored them as best he could, retreating into familiar rhythm of his craft. Selecting a thick, supple length of oiled latigo leather from a roll, he measured with a practiced eye, the rasp of his knife trimming the edge, The solid thump of the mallet driving stitching holes. The steady whish thud of the stitching, all pulling wax thread to the tough hide. These are the sounds of solitude, a language he understood. Yet he was acutely aware of the woman's tension humming like a plucked wire, the child's unnerving stillness. Abigail stood near the pile of leather scraps by the wall, picking up a smooth offcut, turning it over in her hands. Her movements were taut, her attention constantly flickering toward the open door and the street beyond. "My husband," she said suddenly, her voice startling the rhythmic quiet. "He was good with his hands, could mend near anything." She paused, the leather scrap held tight. "On the farm." The words hung, heavy with the unspoken before. Wasn't much he couldn't fix. A brittle silence followed. Silas didn't look up, but his hands still for a fraction of a second. He knew the shape of that silence. It was the silence of an empty chair, of a tool left untouched. "Pa made Molly a chair," Tess murmured, her voice small and clear as a dropped pebble. She held up her one-armed doll. "A tiny one." She didn't look at Silas. She spoke to the doll. Abigail's breath caught. She knelt swiftly, pulling Tess close, smoothing her hair with a hand that trembled. "He did, sweet pea," she whispered, her voice thick. "He surely did." Silas felt the cold weight of the pocket watch in his vest like a brand. "Gone away." The child's simple, devastating words echoed in the hollow space within him. He'd taken the watch out without realizing it, a habit born of muscle memory when his mind wandered treacherous paths. It lay on the bench beside his mallet, the silver catching a sliver of light from the window, the etched initials, MEB just visible. Mary Elizabeth Boone. He snatched it up, the metal cool against his palm for a fleeting second before he shoved it back into his pocket, a hard lump against his ribs. He picked up the awl again, driving the needle through the leather with sharp, precise jabs, focusing on the bite of the steel, the pull of the thread, anything but the ache that yawned wide inside him. He worked with renewed intensity, the silence now a tangible thing, woven with shared, unacknowledged grief. Abigail retreated to the doorway, a sentinel scanning the eastern road, every line of her body screaming vigilance. Tess sat quietly on an overturned nail keg near the scrap pile, whispering secrets to Molly. Finally, Silas secured the last stitch, trimmed the thread ends, and tested the new girth strap. It was solid, unyielding, a band of strength against the world's fragility. He carried the saddle back out into the late afternoon. Abigail followed instantly, Tess at her heels. The sun was sinking toward the razorback line of distant mountains, painting the sky in washes of ochre and deepening blue. Long, cool shadows stretched across the hard-packed earth. The wind had gentled, carrying now the scent of cooling earth and distant sage. Silas efficiently resaddled the mare, cinching the new strap with firm, experienced hands. He checked the buckles, smoothed the leather. "Done," he announced, stepping back. "Hold better on the horse will." Abigail touched the new strap, her fingers tracing the neat, strong stitching. A flicker of something like wonder crossed her exhausted face. It's good. Strong. Thank you, mister." Her eyes lifted to the sign above the door. Boone. She fumbled again for the small pouch at her waist, pulling out the few meager coins. "Please, for the leather. It's all I have right now, but I can—" Silas cut her off with a sharp shake of his head. "Keep it." He turned towards his shop door. The transaction was over. He'd done what the echo of a child's lost eyes had compelled him to do. Now he craved the solitude, the predictable silence broken only by the scrape of his tools. Get the girl some biscuits at the mercantile. "Mr. Boone." Abigail's voice was a whip crack of pure terror. Silas spun around. She wasn't looking at him. She was staring, transfixed, down the eastern road, her face bleached bone white, her free hand pressed hard against her mouth. Tess clutched her leg, her small body rigid, her face hidden in her mother's skirt. Silas followed her gaze. On the eastern horizon, Where the fading light met the vast, empty plain, a thick plume of dust rose. It wasn't the lazy spiral of a lone rider or a wandering steer. It was a roiling, dark brown cloud, churned by multiple hooves, moving fast. Too fast. It billowed upwards, catching the last bloody rays of the sun, staining the twilight in ominous ochre. Then the sound reached them, carried on the cooling breeze, a low, rhythmic thunder. Faint at first, then growing steadily louder, more insistent. Not the wind, not a stampede. Hoofbeats, many of them, riding hard, coming straight for Sage Bend. Abigail made a choked, animal sound. Her eyes, wide with a terror that bordered on panic, met Silas's for one fractured second, a silent scream, a desperate, wordless plea. Then she wrenched Tess up into her arms, holding the child tightly against her chest, turning her body as if to physically shield her from the storm of dust and pounding hooves still miles away, but closing the distance with terrifying speed. Silas stood rooted to the spot beside the weary bay mare, the dust of the approaching riders already a bruise on the twilight sky. The simple act of mending a broken strap, the fragile bridge of shared silence built over a child's whispered memory, suddenly felt like striking a match in a powder keg. Trouble, she called it. Trouble was a dark cloud on the horizon. Trouble was a drumbeat shaking the earth. Trouble was riding in with the dying of the light. And Silas Boone, the solitary saddler who tried to fix one small, broken thing, found himself standing directly in its path, the unfamiliar weight of someone else's dread settling cold and heavy on his shoulders. The watch in his pocket felt suddenly like a millstone. The thunder grew. It wasn't the sky's kind. This was earthbound, deliberate, a drum roll announcing violence. Dust, thick and ochre in the dying light, boiled toward Sage Bend like a malevolent storm front. Abigail Holt made a sound, low and wounded, clutching Tess so fiercely the child whimpered into her skirt. Silas Boone moved, not with panic, but with the ingrained, economical motion of a man who'd faced charging lines before. He stepped sideways, placing his body between the widow and the open yard, his hand brushing the worn walnut grip of the Colt holstered at his hip, a gesture of habit, not intent. Yet, inside, he said, his voice gravel-scraped but steady. He didn't look at her. His flint blue eyes were fixed on the approaching dust cloud, gauging its speed, its spread. 3 riders, maybe 4, moving hard, back corner, now. Abigail didn't hesitate this time. Terror overrode pride. She scooped Tess fully into her arms, the girl's rag doll dangling forgotten, and stumbled backwards through the saddler doorway, vanishing into the deeper gloom within. The bay mare, sensing the tension, laid her ears flat and sidestepped nervously, her hooves scraping on the hardpan. Silas reached out, caught her bridle with a firm, calming hand. "Easy now," he murmured, the words to the horse, but perhaps also for the pounding in his own chest. Trouble. She'd named it true. They materialized out of the dust like specters conjured by the twilight. 3 men, riding lathered horses that blew great plumes of steam into the cooling air. They reined up sharply in the yard before the saddlery, the sudden halt sending fresh clouds of grit swirling around their boots. The leader, a broad-shouldered man with a face like weathered saddle leather and a thick rust-colored beard, swung down first. His eyes, small and dark as river stones, swept over Silas, the mare, the open doorway, missing nothing. A long, thin scar puckered the skin from his left temple down to his jawline, pale against the sun-darkened skin. Jeb Holt, the name surfaced in Silas's mind unbidden, pulled from Abigail's terrified whisper of brothers. The second brother dismounted more fluidly. He was leaner, younger, with cold, pale eyes that held no warmth, only calculation. He wore his gun low and tied down, the holster worn smooth with use. Micah, he spat a stream of tobacco juice onto the dust near Silas's boots, a deliberate challenge in the silence. The third brother remained mounted for a moment longer, a restless figure with restless eyes that darted from the stable to the saloon down the street. He had a coiled energy about him, fingers drumming on his saddle horn. Ezekiel. His gaze finally settled on the saddler door, a cruel twist playing on his lips. Where is she, saddler? Jeb's voice was a low rumble, like distant rock slide. He took a step forward, his bulk imposing. He carried a wrapped bundle under one arm, about the size of a small ledger book, tied tightly with rough twine. It looked incongruously neat against his rough-spun clothes and the dust coating him. The gift. Silas noted it, filed it away. It looked heavy for its size. Silas didn't flinch. He kept his hand near, but not on his colt. Inside, he kept his answer short, flat, giving nothing. The wind, gentler now, sighed through the sagebrush beyond the town, carrying the scent of horse sweat and tension. Took her damn time getting here, Micah stated, his cold eyes scanning the stable's shadowed interior. We've been riding hard. He shifted, his hand hovering near his own gun, but the implication hung in the air. Because of her, Ezekiel finally swung down, his movements quick, almost jerky. Heard, she had trouble. His voice was higher, sharper than his brother's. He peered past Silas toward the doorway. Where's the brat? The word was casual, dismissive, like asking about a stray dog. Something tightened in Silas's gut, the casual cruelty, the ownership in their tone. He remembered Tessa's wide, silent eyes, the way she clutched her broken doll. He remembered another small face, swallowed by fever. Gone away. The pocket watch felt like ice against his ribs. He shifted his weight slightly, blocking Ezekiel's line of sight more completely. They're resting. Jeb grunted, unimpressed. He hefted the wrapped bundle slightly. Got something for her, from the old place. He didn't elaborate. His dark eyes bored into Silas's. You the one fix a rig? Silas gave a curt nod. Strap was rotten. Charitable of you, Micah drawled, the sarcasm thick. Or just stupid? His pale eyes flickered over Silas's worn clothes. The simple shop, assessing threat, finding little. A solitary saddler wasn't much to reckon with. Needed fixin', Silas replied, his voice devoid of inflection. He wouldn't rise to the bait. Not yet. He kept his focus on Jeb, the obvious leader. The air crackled with unspoken threats. The horses stamped and blew, the only sound beside the brothers' heavy breathing and the wind's soft sigh. Inside the saddlery, Silas imagined Abigail pressed into the darkest corner, Tess buried against her, both holding their breath. The scent of oiled leather and pine pitch from the shop mingled uneasily with the dust and sweat smell of the newcomers. Well, Jeb said after a heavy pause. He took another step, stopping barely an arm's length from Silas. Up close, Silas could see the network of fine lines around his eyes, the hard set of his jaw. This was a man accustomed to command, to being obeyed. He thrust the wrapped bundle toward Silas. Give this to her. Tell her we'll be at the Lone Star. She comes tonight. No excuses. His gaze swept over Silas again, lingering on the colt. Don't make this your business. Saddler. It ain't. Silas didn't reach for the bundle. He met Jeb's stare, the flint in his own eyes meeting the river stone. A memory flashed, unbidden and unwelcome. Mud churned to bloody soup, screams lost in cannon roar, a young soldier. Billy, his name was Billy. Reach out a hand as the rebel line surged forward. Silas had been reloading, fumbling with cold-numb fingers. He'd looked up, met Billy's terrified eyes for a split second, then the impact, the awful stillness. He hadn't been fast enough. He'd carried that look, that failure, long in the war. The weight in his vest pocket felt suddenly crushing. He wouldn't be too slow again. Not here, not for a child trembling in the shadows. She's under my roof, Silas stated, the words quiet but carrying in the tense stillness. It wasn't quite a challenge, but a line drawn in the dust at his feet. Micah's hand dropped fully onto his gun. Ezekiel hissed a breath through his teeth, a feral sound. Jeb's expression didn't change, but his eyes hardened, turning colder than the Wyoming night descending around them. He held the bundle out for another heartbeat, then let it drop. It landed at Silas's boots with a soft, heavy thud, raising a tiny puff of dust. "Suit yourself," Jeb said, his voice dangerously soft. "Just deliver the message. And the remembrance." He spat the last word. "She knows the consequences of keeping us waiting." He turned abruptly, the dismissal absolute. "Mount up." Micah's cold stare lingered on Silas for a moment longer, a promise of future reckoning in his pale eyes, before he too turned and swung onto his horse. Ezekiel scrambled up last, casting one last, hungry glance towards the saddler door. Without another word, Jeb wheeled his horse and kicked it into a trot, heading back down the street towards the distant, dimly lit windows of the Lone Star Saloon. Micah and Ezekiel followed, their horses kicking up fresh, smaller clouds of dust that quickly merged with the settling haze of their arrival. The rhythmic thunder faded, replaced once more by the wind's lonely whisper and the frantic beating of Silas's own heart against the cold weight of the watch. He stood rigid for a long moment after the sound of their horses vanished, staring at the bundle at his feet. It lay there, an alien thing in the familiar dust of his yard, wrapped in coarse sacking, tied tight. A remembrance from the old place. Nothing good came wrapped like that. He could still feel the imprint of Jeb Holt's cold stare, the predatory hunger in Ezekiel's eyes, the lethal calculation in Micah's. Trouble, indeed, and he'd stepped right into its path. Taking a deep, steadying breath that did little to calm the turmoil inside, Silas finally bent and picked up the bundle. It was surprisingly heavy for its size, solid. He carried it inside, the transition from fading twilight to the lantern-lit gloom of the saddler momentarily blinding. Abigail was still pressed into the far corner, near the pile of leather scraps. She'd sunk to the floor, Tess cradled in her lap, the child's face hidden against her neck. Abigail's own face was ashen, tear tracks cutting through the dust on her cheeks, her eyes wide pools of residual terror fixed on the doorway. Tess clutched her doll with a death grip, her small body trembling. Silas closed the door softly behind him, the latch clicking like a gunshot in the silence. He set the heavy bundle down on his workbench, away from the tools. The lamplight flickered, casting long, dancing shadows. "They're gone," he said, his voice rough. "For now, to the Lone Star." Abigail flinched at the saloon's name. She closed her eyes, a shudder running through her. "Ezekiel," the name was a choked whisper. "Saw the girl," Silas confirmed bluntly. He saw no point in softening it. "Asked after her." A low moan escaped Abigail's lips. She buried her face in Tess's hair, her shoulders shaking. Tess, sensing her mother's distress, began a soft, hiccuping cry, muffled against the calico fabric. Silas felt profoundly out of his depth. Grief, he understood. This intricate web of fear and family menace was foreign territory. He looked around the shop, seeking something, anything, to offer beyond the stark reality of armed, hostile brothers demanding her presence. His gaze fell on Tessa's doll Molly, lying abandoned near the door where it had fallen. One arm was completely detached now, hanging by a few threads. He walked over her, picked it up. The rag fabric was faded, grubby. He retrieved a small awl and a length of sturdy linen thread from his bench, the tools incongruous for the task. Without a word, he brought the doll and the tools over to Abigail. He didn't offer them directly. He simply placed them on the floorboard within her reach, beside a smooth scrap of soft deerskin he grabbed. Abigail lifted her head, her eyes red-rimmed and confused, then following his gesture to the doll and tools. Understanding dawned, flickering through the fear. A small task, something to do with her hands, something normal, something for her child. A lifeline thrown. Slowly, hesitantly, she reached out. Her fingers, still trembling, brushed the deerskin scrap, then picked up the awl and thread. She didn't speak. She gently shifted Tess, settling the girl more comfortably beside her, though Tess kept one small fist tightly clenched in her mother's skirt. Abigail picked up Molly's detached arm, aligning it with the ragged shoulder socket. Her hands, roughened by work but capable, began the careful process of stitching, the needle moving with practiced, if shaky, motions. The repetitive action seemed to steady her, a tiny anchor in the storm. Silas watched for a moment, the simple domesticity of it striking a chord deep within him. He remembered Mary humming softly while mending his shirts by the firelight, the peaceful rhythm of it. The ache flared, sharp and fresh. He turned away, busying himself with the practical. He filled the dented tin canteen cup with fresh water from the barrel and placed it beside Abigail. Then he rummaged near the cold, pot-bellied stove in the corner, finding a relatively clean, though threadbare, horse blanket. He shook it out, the dust motes dancing in the lamplight, and draped it loosely over Abigail's and Tessa's shoulders. Abigail paused her stitching. She looked up at him, her gray eyes searching his face in the flickering light. The raw terror had receded slightly, replaced by a profound weariness and a dawning, fragile gratitude. "Thank you, Mr. Boone," she whispered, her voice raw, for all this. Her gaze flickered toward the ominous bundle on the workbench, then back to him, a question hanging unspoken in the air. "What is it? What do they want?" Silas merely nodded, a tight, wordless acknowledgement. He moved to the single grimy window, peering out into the now fully dark street. A few feeble lights glowed in windows down the way. The Lone Star sign was a brighter smear of yellow in the distance. All seemed quiet, but the silence felt charged, expectant, like the held breath before a gunshot. He could still feel the weight of Jeb Holt's threat, the cold promise in Micah's eyes. He needed air, needed to think. The confines of the saddlery, thick with fear and the unknown weight of that bundle, pressed in on him. "Gonna check the mare," he muttered, more to himself than to Abigail. "Secure the stable." It was an excuse, but a necessary one. He needed a moment outside the circle of their dread. He picked up the dented tin lantern from its hook near the door, lit it with a lucifer match that flared sulphur-bright in the gloom, and stepped back out into the night. The cool air hit him, sharp and clean after the stifling atmosphere inside. He hung the lantern on a nail outside the stable door, its weak, wavering light casting long, distorted shadows across the hard-packed earth of the yard. The bay mare whickered softly from her stall inside, a familiar, grounding sound. Silas walked toward the spot where the Holt brothers had dismounted, the lantern light pooling around his boots. He scanned the ground, not entirely sure what he was looking for. A drop clue? A sign of their intent? Mostly. He saw churned dust, hoof prints overlapping. He was about to turn back when a glint caught his eye, a tiny spark of reflected lantern light, near where Ezekiel's restless horse had stood. He knelt, brushing aside the loose dirt. It was a coin, not silver but brass or maybe copper, worn nearly smooth. He picked it up, holding it close to the lantern's flame. It was larger than a standard penny, crudely made. On one side, it bore the image of crude, stooping bird, a vulture perhaps, and on the other, a single word deeply stamped, Reaper. The word sent an involuntary chill down his spine, colder than the night air. It wasn't government mint. It wasn't currency. It was a token, a marker, belonging to Ezekiel Holt, or something larger. Reaper. The implications were dark, ominous. Trouble wasn't just three brothers. It wore a name, and it left calling cards. He pocketed the cold metal disc, its weight a new, unsettling counterpoint to the pocket watch. As he straightened, his gaze swept the dark expanse beyond the meager circle of lantern light, towards the distant, glowing windows of the Lone Star Saloon. Abigail's whispered words echoed in his mind, trouble chasing shadows. He understood now. The shadows had names, Jeb, Micah, Ezekiel, and they carried a gift heavy with malice, and a token promising a grim harvest. Inside the saddlery, a widow stitched a doll's arm, clinging to the smallest semblance of normalcy for her child. Outside, under a vast, indifferent sky pricked with cold stars, Silas Boone stood guard, the marked coin a cold brand in his pocket, knowing the night was far from over, and the reapers were waiting. The brass coin felt like a brand in Silas's pocket, colder and more menacing than the Wyoming night air. Reaper, the word echoed in his skull, a grim counterpoint to soft, rhythmic sobs still emanating from the saddler's dim interior. He stood for a moment longer in the lantern's frail halo, the vast darkness pressing in, the distant yellow smear of the lone star, saloon a beacon of trouble. The wind carried a faint, discordant tinkle of the piano and the murmur of rough voices, sounds that felt alien and threatening in the tense quiet of his yard. Abigail Holt's brothers were there, drinking, waiting, plotting. He took a final, deep breath, the scent of sagebrush and cooling earth doing little to clear the dread coiling in his gut. He needed to be inside. He needed to understand the burden he'd accepted along with that cursed bundle. Snuffing the lantern, but keeping it hooked near the stable door, a dim sentinel against the dark. Silas turned and stepped back into the saddlery, closing the heavy door behind him and throwing the solid wooden bar across it. The thunk of the bar settling into its brackets was a small, necessary comfort in the face of the unknown. The air inside was thick with spent fear and the lingering smells of leather and oil. Abigail sat huddled on the floor near the cold stove, the threadbare horse blanket pulled tight around her shoulders, and Tess, who had finally cried herself into an exhausted, fitful sleep against her mother's chest. Molly the doll, her arm now securely reattached with neat, strong stitches that spoke of Abigail's regained composure, lay tucked beside Tess. Abigail's eyes, red-rimmed but dry now, lifted to meet Silas's as he entered. They held a desperate, searching look, flickering between his face and the wrapped bundle lying like a sleeping viper on his workbench. What is it?" Her voice was a threadbare whisper. "Scrape raw." Silas didn't know. He walked to the bench, the rough sacking seeming to pulse in the flickering light of a single oil lamp. It felt heavy with malice. He picked it up, the weight solid and unyielding. He carried it not to Abigail, but to the clearer space near the door, away from the sleeping child. He set it on the floorboards. "Best find out," he said, his voice low. He drew the skinning knife sheathed at his belt, a tool not a weapon, but sharp enough to cut twine and truth. Abigail watched, her breath held, as he sliced through the rough cord binding the sacking. He peeled the coarse fabric back, layer by layer, revealing not a ledger but a small, sturdy wooden box, its dark finish scarred and worn. It bore no lock, only a simple brass clasp. Silas flipped the clasp open and lifted the lid. Inside, resting on a bed of faded blue velvet, lay two objects. The first was a folded, official-looking document, heavy parchment sealed with cracked, red wax insignia Silas couldn't immediately decipher in the dim light. The second was a woman's locket. It was oval, made of tarnished silver, hanging from a delicate, slightly kinked chain. It looked old, valuable, and profoundly out of place amidst the rough sacking and scarred wood. Silas picked up the document first, unfolding it carefully. The script was dense, legalistic. His eyes scanned the formal language. "Hereby grant title and deed, the land known as Blackwater Springs comprising 160 acres." His gaze snagged on the names. Grantor, Josiah Holt. Grantee, Abigail Holt née Vance. Dated 6 months prior. He looked up at Abigail. "It's a deed to land. Blackwater Springs. In your name." Abigail's hand flew to her mouth, stifling a gasp that was equal parts shock and horror. Her eyes widened, not with joy, but with dawning terror. "Blackwater?" she breathed, the name a curse. But Pa sold that years ago, to them. The implication hung heavy. The brothers. Why would they give this back? Now! Her gaze darted to the locket as Silas lifted it gently from a box. The chain felt cold, almost lifeless, in his fingers. "And this?" he asked, holding it out. Abigail recoiled as if it were a live coal. Her face paled further, her eyes fixed on the locket with unmistakable recognition and revulsion. That was Ma's," she whispered, her voice trembling violently. Pa gave it to her the day Ezekiel was born. She never took it off. A shudder racked her frame. Not even when they buried her. She wrapped her arms tighter around Tess, drawing strength from the child's sleeping form. Jeb took it off her after, said it was Hope property. Her voice dropped to a raw whisper. He wore it sometimes, like a trophy. The cold weight of the reaper, coin seemed to burn through Silas's pocket. A deed to contested land in a dead mother's locket, stolen by a brother who asked after a child with casual cruelty. These weren't gifts, they were threats. Symbols of ownership, of a past Abigail couldn't escape, delivered with chilling finality. She comes tonight. No excuses. Jeb's words echoed. What did they want her to do with these things? Sign the deed over? Wear the locket like a brand? Silas carefully placed the locket back in the box and refolded the deed. He closed the lid, the soft click sounding unnaturally loud. He pushed the box away, toward the wall, wanting it out of immediate sight. They mean to trap you, he stated flatly, with paper and memory. Abigail nodded mutely, tears welling again but not falling. Her gaze remained fixed on the box, as if it might spring open on its own. They want Blackwater, she said, her voice gaining a thread of steel beneath the fear. Always did. Pa left it to me in his will a surprise. Said the boys had hardness in them, needed softening. They found out after he passed. She swallowed hard, her knuckles white where she gripped the blanket. They contested it, said Pa wasn't right in the head. Harassed my Tom, my husband, drove us off our farm further south. Her voice hitched on her husband's name. Then, the fire, in the barn. Tom was inside. The words were stark, stripped bare. They said it was an accident. Lightning. Her gray eyes met Silas's, filled with a grief so profound it mirrored his own. There was no storm that night, Mr. Boone. The silence that followed was thick with shared understanding. Loss wasn't a stranger to either of them. Silas felt a familiar ache bloom beneath his ribs. The cold silver of the pocket watched a constant companion. He remembered the frantic ride home from Cheyenne, the hope curdling into dread as he saw the quarantine flag, the awful stillness of the cabin, Mary's hand, already cold, clutching that tiny carved horse for their boy. He'd been too late, always too late. Like with Billy in the mud, reaching out, the guilt was a familiar scar, worn smooth by time but no less painful. He'd failed to protect what mattered most. He wouldn't fail this woman and her child. Not to fire, not to brothers who carried reaper, tokens, and dead mothers' lockets. He moved away from the box, the symbol of hope malice. He walked to the water barrel, filled the tin cup again, and brought it to Abigail. He didn't speak. The gesture said enough. Drink. Breathe. You're not alone in this. Abigail took the cup with trembling hands, sipping slowly. Her eyes, over rim, held a flicker of something beyond terror now. A fragile, burgeoning trust. Tom, he was like you, she murmured, her voice barely audible. Quiet, good with his hands. Built our house. She looked down at Tess, smoothing a strand of hair from the child's damp forehead. He'd have fought for her, like you're doing. Silas felt an unfamiliar tightness in his throat. He looked away, his gaze falling on his workbench, the tools of his solitude. His hand drifted to his vest pocket, his fingers brushing the familiar shape of the watch through the fabric. A decision crystallized within him. He pulled it out, the silver catching the lamplight, the worn initials MEB clearly visible. He held in his palm for a moment, the cool metal a tangible link to his own shattered past, then offered it, not to Abigail, but towards the sleeping Tess. A silent testament, a shared burden of loss, a promise. Mary Elizabeth, he said, the name feeling strange, almost sacred, on his tongue after so long locked away. My wife, and our boy Samuel. Cholera took him 10 years back. He didn't elaborate on the emptiness, the years of silence. The offering of the watch spoke volumes. Abigail's eyes filled with fresh tears, but they were softer now, born of shared sorrow, not just fear. She reached out, not to take the watch, but to gently close Silas's fingers over it. Her touch was light, brief, but warm. "They remembered," she whispered, "just like Tom, just like my ma." It was an acknowledgement, a binding of their separate griefs into a fragile shield against the darkness outside. A sudden, sharp sound shattered the moment. A boot scuffing gravel, close outside the saddlery wall. Near the front, Silas was on his feet instantly, the watch back in his pocket, his hand dropping to the Colt. He motioned sharply for Abigail to stay down, to shield Tess. He moved like smoke, silent and swift, extinguishing the oil lamp with a quick pinch of his fingers, plunging the room into near-total darkness save for the faintest gray seepage around the shuttered window. He pressed himself against the wall beside the barred door, ears straining. Silence. Then the faintest scritch-scritch, like a fingernail or a knife point, dragging slowly across the outside with the door. It wasn't random. It was deliberate, methodical, a message being carved. Adrenaline spiked through Silas, cold and sharp. He drew the Colt, the click of the hammer easing back barely audible. Abigail huddled lower, pulling the blanket over Tessa's head, her own breathing shallow and rapid. The scritching stopped. A pause. Then soft, retreating footsteps, fading quickly into the night. Silas waited, counting his own heartbeats in the oppressive dark. 10, 20. Only the wind sighed outside. He risked a glance through the narrow gap beside the door shutter. The yard was empty, bathed in starlight. The lantern by the stable cast its weak pool, undisturbed. He eased the bar back and opened the door just enough to slip out, Colt ready. The cool air bit his face. He scanned the shadows, the empty street, the distant saloon glow. Nothing moved. He turned his attention to the door. Near the latch, freshly gouged into the weathered pine, was a crude symbol, two intersecting lines forming a rough X, and beside it a single deeply carved letter, R. Reaper. The brass coin felt like ice against his thigh. They hadn't just left a token. They'd signed their threat on his door. A promise. A marker. Silas traced the rough groove of the R with a calloused finger. It wasn't just Ezekiel's brand. It was a name, a warning. And it was here at his threshold. He stepped back inside, rebarring the door with finality. He didn't relight the lamp. The darkness felt safer now. A cloak. Abigail's eyes were wide saucers in the gloom, reflecting the faint starlight from the window. "What was it?" she breathed. Silas didn't answer immediately. He walked to the workbench, feeling for the box containing the deed and the locket. He picked it up, its weight a grim anchor. He carried it to the darkest corner of the shop, near the pile of leather scraps, and buried it deep beneath the heavy, folded hides. Out of sight, but not out of mind. "They marked the door," he finally said, his voice low and hard as flint in the darkness. He moved towards Abigail and Tess, a solid shadow against the deeper black. "They're reminding us they're waiting." He sank down onto the floor a few feet away, his back against the cold ire of the stove, the Colt resting on his knee. His eyes remained fixed on the barred door, on the unseen mark that screamed Reaper. "We wait too. We wait for dawn." Abigail nodded, pulling Tess closer. The child stirred, murmuring in her sleep. The silence stretched, taut as a bowstring. The wind moaned softly around the eaves. Somewhere, far off, a coyote yipped, a lonely sound in the vast night. Silas kept his vigil, the image of the carved R burning in his mind, the weight of the deed and the stolen locket a silent accusation in the dark. The saloon's distant murmur felt louder now, a predatory hum on the edge of hearing. The night pressed in heavy and watchful, filled with the ghosts of the past and the sharp, present threat of men who left Reaper's marks on doors. Suddenly, Tess whimpered, a small, frightened sound. Then she cried out, sharp and piercing in the tense silence, not fully awake, trapped in a nightmare. "No, don't, Uncle Zeke." The name hung in the dark air like a gunshot. Abigail gasped, clutching her daughter. Silas tensed, every sense screaming alert, his finger tightening on the Colt's trigger as his eyes stabbed toward the door, expecting it to burst inward under the force of the nightmare made real. The echo of the child's terrified cries seemed to vibrate in the very walls of the saddlery, a chilling confirmation that the waiting, for any of them, might be the hardest part of all. Tessa's cry, "Uncle Zeke," hung in the darkness like shattered glass, sharp and terrifying. Abigail clamped a hand over her daughter's mouth, muffling the whimpers that followed, her own body rigid with fear. Silas remained frozen against the cold iron of the stove, every nerve screaming, his finger taut on the Colt's trigger, his eyes boring into the barred door where the crude are seen to pulse in his imagination. He expected splintering wood, the roar of gunfire, the violent intrusion of the nightmare-made flesh. But only silence answered, the deep, watchful silence of the Wyoming night, broken only by the wind's mournful sigh around the eaves and Tessa's muffled, panicked breathing. Seconds stretched into an eternity. Nothing. No boot stomp, no demand shouted, no battering ram. Just the oppressive weight of the dark and the unseen threat coiled at the edge of town. Slowly, deliberately, Silas eased the hammer of the Colt back down. The soft click was deafening in the stillness. He let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding, the air scraping raw in his throat. "Just a dream," he murmured, his voice low and rough, more for Abigail's benefit than his own conviction. "Just a dream." Abigail slowly removed her hand from Tessa's mouth. The child gulped air, her small body trembling violently against her mother. Her wide, terror-stricken eyes darted around the pitch-black room. "He hit fire," she whimpered, the words fragmented, chilling. "In his hands." Abigail gathered Tess closer, rocking her gently, humming a tuneless, shaky lullaby that seemed more for her own shattered nerves than the child's. "Shuh, sweet pea, just a bad dream. Mama's here. Silas is here." Her voice cracked on his name, a fragile lifeline thrown in the dark. The mention of fire twisted a knife in Silas's gut. Abigail's stark words from earlier echoed. Then the fire. In the barn. Tom was inside. Ezekiel Holt, the restless, hungry-eyed brother, asking after the child, leaving a reaper token. Tess dreaming of fire in his hands. The pieces clicked together with grim certainty. This wasn't just about land. It was about silencing a witness, erasing a past crime. Blackwater Springs wasn't just valuable acreage. It was the key to a murder the brothers thought was buried. Silas pushed himself up on the floor, his muscles protesting the tense vigil. He moved silently to the shuttered window, peering through the narrow gap. The yard lay bathed in cold starlight, frost already beginning to glitter, like scattered diamonds on the hard-packed earth. The lantern by the stable cast its weak, unwavering pool. Nothing moved. The distant yellow glow of the Lone Star Saloon still pulsed, a malevolent heartbeat in the night. He scanned the shadows near the door, half expecting to see Ezekiel's lean figure materialize. But there was only stillness. The carved R was invisible in the dark, but its presence felt like a physical weight pressing against the wood. He turned back to the room's oppressive gloom. Abigail was trying to soothe Tess, but her own terror vibrated in the air. They couldn't just wait for dawn like trapped animals. Waiting was the enemy Ezekiel and his brothers counted on. It wore down resolve, sharpened fear. Silas needed to act. He needed to understand. "Stay low," he instructed Abigail, his voice barely above a whisper. He felt his way to the workbench, locating the stub of a tallow candle and a lucifer match. He struck it against the bench leg. The sudden flare blindingly brightened the darkness, illuminating Abigail's pale, strained face and Tessa's wide, frightened eyes for a fleeting second before he touched it to the candle wick. A small, steady flame bloomed, pushing back the deepest shadows, revealing the familiar contours of the saddlery, the hanging tools, the rolls of leather, the heavy folds where he'd hidden the cursed box. The candlelight caught the edge of a smooth piece of scrap pine on his bench, discarded from a saddle horn project. An idea sparked, born of desperation and the need to offer Tess something tangible, something safe, in this world of shadows and fire. He picked up the wood, feeling its grain beneath his calloused thumb. He unsheathed his belt knife, the blade winking in the candlelight. Without a word, he began to carve, not with the intricate precision of his saddlery work, but with swift, sure strokes, shaving away curls of pale wood. Abigail watched him, confusion momentarily overriding fear. Tess, drawn by the small, focused movement in the dim light, quieted her whimpers, her eyes fixed on Silas's hands. He worked quickly, the rhythmic scrape of the knife a counterpoint to the tense silence. The shape emerged, a simple, sturdy horse, its head held high, its legs sturdy blocks. No fine details, just a solid, comforting form. He smoothed the rough edges with his thumb, blew away the sawdust. Finished, he held out towards Tess, not speaking, just offering the small wooden figure in the flickering light. Tess hesitated, her small hand clutching Molly the doll tighter. She looked at her mother. Abigail gave a tiny, encouraging nod, her eyes reflecting the candle flame and a dawning understanding. Slowly, tentatively, Tess reached out. Her fingers, cold and small, brushed the smooth with a little horse, then closed around it. She pulled it close, tucking it beside Molly under the horse blanket. She didn't smile, but the frantic trembling in her shoulders eased slightly. She traced the curve of the horse's back with one finger, a fragile anchor in the storm. "Samuel, my boy," Silas began, the name still unfamiliar on his tongue after years of silence. He looked not at Tess, but at the candle flame, seeing another small face in its glow. He loved horses, carved ones, had a little herd on his windowsill. The memory was a physical ache, sharp and sweet, made him for him. He met Abigail's gaze across the small circle of light. The offering of the watch had been a symbol of shared grief. The horse was a bridge to a lost joy, a flicker of hope offered to Tess. Abigail's eyes welled, but this time the tears weren't solely of fear. They held a profound gratitude, a recognition of the immense trust Silas was extending. "It's strong," she whispered, her voice thick. "Like him. Thank you, Silas." The use of his first name was deliberate, a quiet pact sealed in the candlelight. Silas nodded, the tightness in his throat returning. He pocketed his knife. The small act had steadied him too. He turned his attention back to the threat. "Blackwater," he said, his voice low and urgent. "Why is it worth fire? Worth this?" He gestured vaguely towards the door, the hidden box, the terror in the room. Abigail took a deep, shaky breath, drawing strength from the sleeping form of Tess now clutching both doll and wooden horse. "Water," she said, the word heavy with significance. Not just a spring, a source. Reliable, sweet water, year-round, bubbling right up out of the rock. In that dry country, it's life, it's power. Pa knew it. That's why he left it to me, hidden in a codicil they only found later. Her gray eyes hardened. "Jeb, he wants to be a cattle baron. Needs water to control the range. Micah, he sees a toll station, charging everyone who passes. Ezekiel," she shuddered, "he just likes taking things, breaking them. Blackwater was always the prize. Tom and me, we were just in the way. Proof Pa didn't trust them." Her gaze flickered to the hidden box. "That deed, signing it over to them, is the only thing that'll satisfy Jeb. Or maybe," her voice dropped to a horrified whisper, "maybe removing the last witness is cleaner." Silas absorbed this. Water, not gold, but just as precious in this harsh land. The motive was clear, brutal, and rooted in greed and a desire to erase the past. The locket was a cruel reminder of their mother, another thing taken. The Reaper mark wasn't just Ezekiel's brand. It was a brother's calling card for death and acquisition. He thought of Billy reaching out in the mud, the awful feeling of helplessness. He thought of the quarantine flag, the silent cabin. He had been too late then. He wouldn't be now. Not for Abigail. Not for Tess. His own ghost demanded it. "We need to know their plan," Silas stated, his voice flat, resolute. "Waiting here makes us targets." He glanced towards the door. The carved R felt like a target painted on his back. He needed to see it again, understand in the light. See if there was more. He needed to scout. He stood, picking up the Colt. "Stay here. Keep the candle low. Bar the door behind me." He saw the flare of panic in Abigail's eyes. "Just checking the yard. Listening." Abigail swallowed hard, then nodded, a flicker of her earlier resilience returning. She reached beneath the blanket, pulling out a small, cloth-wrapped bundle from her skirt pocket. "Herbs. Lavender, maybe, and something pungent. For calm," she murmured, crushing a dried leaf between her fingers, holding it near Tessa's nose. The familiar scent seemed to soothe the child further. "I'll watch." Silas moved to the door. He lifted the heavy bar silently, eased the door open just enough to slip through, and closed it softly behind him. He heard the reassuring thunk of the bar sliding back into place. The cold hit him like a physical blow after the close air inside. Frost crunched under his boots. The stars burned fiercely cold in the vast black dome overhead, illuminating the silent town in shades of silver and deep blue shadow. Sage Ben slept, or pretended to. He moved like a ghost along front of the saddlery, his colt held low and ready. He stopped at the spot near the latch. In the stark starlight, the carving was stark and ugly. The crude X, the deeply gouged R. He ran his fingers over it. The wood was fresh, splintered. Nothing else nearby. No footprints distinct in the frost-hardened earth. He crouched, scanning the ground meticulously. Near the base of the door, almost hidden in the shadow where the wall met the earth, something gleamed dully. Not another coin. A small brass cartridge casing. .44 caliber. Freshly dropped. He picked it up. It was cold. Empty. Someone had chambered a round right here, right outside his door, while carving their grim signature. A deliberate reminder of their firepower. A promise. As he straightened, a new sound reached him, carried on the still, frigid air, not from the door, but from the direction of the stable. A soft, rhythmic thump, 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 like a fist lightly pounding on wood. Silas's blood ran cold. He melted into the deeper shadow beside the saddlery wall, every sense straining. The sound came again, clearer now. Not the stable door. The side of the stable, the shared wall with the saddlery. Thump, thump, thump. A deliberate, mocking beat. Then a low, guttural chuckle, barely audible but unmistakable. Ezekiel. Silas pressed himself flat against the ruffle of the saddlery, his breath pluming white in the air. The chuckle faded, replaced by the soft crunch of boots on frost moving away, circling around the back of the building, heading toward the rear of the saddlery, towards a small, high window near the scrap pile. Silas moved, not toward the sound, but back to the front door. He couldn't be drawn out, lured away from Abigail and Tess inside. He rapped sharply, a prearranged signal. 2 quick taps, a pause, a third. The bar scraped inside. He slipped back in, instantly rebarring the door. The small candle flame seemed terrifyingly bright now, a beacon. Abigail was on her feet, Tess clutched in her arms, her face etched with fresh terror. "What?" she breathed. "Ezekiel," Silas said, his voice tight. "Outside. Testing. Taunting." He held up the empty cartridge casing. He chambered a round right here. Abigail's hand flew to her mouth, stifling a gasp. Tess buried her face against her mother's neck. The wooden horse clutched tight. Thump. The sound came from the back wall of the saddlery this time, near the high window. A single, solid impact that vibrated through the timber frame. Dust sifted down from the rafters. Abigail cried out softly, stumbling back, pulling Tess with her toward the farthest corner. Silas raised the Colt, aiming it unwaveringly at the back wall, his finger firm on the trigger. The candle flame guttered wildly in the sudden draft. Silence descended again, heavier than before, thick with the promise of violence. Ezekiel was playing with them, letting them know the walls were no barrier, that he could strike whenever he chose. The Reaper wasn't just a mark, it was a countdown, and the brothers weren't waiting for dawn anymore. They were circling. Silas Boone, the solitary saddler who'd fixed a broken strap, stood between a terrified woman, a sleeping child clutching a carved horse, and men who signed their threats with bullets and fire. The fragile piece of the candlelit corner felt like the eye of a hurricane, and the storm walls were closing in. The next thump wouldn't be on wood. The final thump against the back wall echoed like a coffin lid slamming shut. Dust sifted from the rafters, dancing in the guttering candlelight. Abigail pressed Tess deeper into the corner, her body a shield, a low whimper escaping her throat. Silas stood rock still, Colt leveled at the vibrating planks, finger taut on the trigger. Ezekiel's chilling chuckle had faded, but his presence lingered like gunpowder smoke in the frigid air. The taunting rhythm had been a countdown. The storm had arrived. "They're splitting up," Silas hissed, his voice a rasp in the suffocating silence. He kept his eyes locked on the back wall, but his mind mapped the saddler's vulnerabilities. The barred front door, the high side window, the shared wall with the stable where Ezekiel had first drummed his threat. Jeb will come front. Micah, flank. Ezekiel's the spark. Fire in his hands. Tessa's nightmare words burned in Silas's mind. Abigail's eyes, wide with terror, met his. Then, a steely resolve hardened her features, forged in the furnace of loss and the fierce need to protect her child. She gently pried Tessa's clutching hands from her skirt, guiding the girl deeper into the shadowed recess behind the heavy rolls of harness leather stacked near the cold stove. "Stay here, sweet pea," she whispered, her voice surprisingly steady. "Hold Molly and the horse. Be very quiet like a mouse." Tess nodded, her small face pale but solemn, clutching the rag doll and the carved wooden horse Silas had given her, twin talismans against the dark. Abigail rose, her movements swift and silent. She didn't cower. She moved to the pile of scrap leather where Silas had buried the hateful box. With determined hands, she dug through the heavy folds. Pulling it free, she lifted the lid, ignoring the deed, her fingers closing around the cold silver of her mother's locket, the stolen trophy, the symbol of Holt cruelty. She snapped the delicate chain, letting the deed fall back into the velvet. The locket she clenched in her fist, its edges biting into her palm. Silas saw her action, understood. He gave a curt nod, then motioned sharply towards the front door. "They'll expect force," he murmured, his gaze flicking to the Colt. "Give them something else." The memory of Billy reaching out in the mud flashed. Helplessness. Failure. He wouldn't fail this child. He thought of Samuel, the carved horses on the windowsill. Protect the innocent. His own redemption lay in this frozen moment. He holstered the Colt. Instead, he grabbed a heavy iron pry bar leaning against a workbench, a tool, not a weapon. He moved to the front door, lifting the bar silently. Abigail positioned herself beside him, her back against the wall, the locket a cold weight in her fist, her eyes fixed on the latch. Outside, the crunch of boots on frost-laden earth approached the front. One set, heavy, deliberate. Jeb. Silas could almost smell the man's arrogance, his expectation of submission. He heard the faint jingle of spurs. A pause, then a fist hammered against the door, a thunderous boom in the stillness. "Abigail, open up. Time's up." Silas threw the bar aside and yanked the door open, not wide, but enough. He filled the space. The pry bar held loosely at his side, his posture deceptively relaxed. The cold dawn air, pearly gray and biting, rushed in. Jeb Holt stood there, broad-shouldered and imposing, his rust-colored beard frosted, his small, dark eyes narrowed in surprise at seeing Silas, not his sister. Behind him in the yard, Micah stood near the weary bay mare, his hand resting near his tied-down holster, his pale eyes calculating. Ezekiel was nowhere in sight. That was the danger. Where is she, Sadler? Jeb demanded, his voice a low growl. He tried to peer past Silas. We got business. Business is done, Silas stated, his voice flat, carrying the crisp air. He stepped fully outside, forcing Jeb to step back, drawing his attention away from the doorway. Abigail remained hidden just inside, pressed against the wall. She ain't signing your paper. She ain't taking your trinket. He kept his body angled, blocking the view inside, his senses screaming for any sign of Ezekiel's approach. Jeb's face darkened. That ain't your call, Boone. This is family. Blood. He took a step forward, his bulk threatening. You're in the way. Micah drifted closer, a silent, lethal shadow. Told you he was stupid, he drawled, his cold gaze fixed on Silas. Silas didn't flinch. He reached into his pocket, not for the colt, but for the brass coin. He held it up, the weak dawn light catching the crude vulture and the deeply stamped word, Reaper. He saw Jeb's eyes flicker, a flicker of surprise quickly masked. Micah's expression didn't change, but his hand twitched nearer his gun. Found this, Silas said, his voice cutting through the tension, after Ezekiel left his mark, after he played his little drum song on my walls. He looked past Jeb, towards the stable. Where is he, Jeb? Skulking? Ready to strike a match? Like he did at Tom Holt's barn. Jeb's face contorted with rage. You shut your filthy mouth. That was an accident. Was it? Abigail's voice rang out, clear and sharp as breaking ice. She stepped from the doorway, holding up the silver locket. It dangled from her fingers, catching the pale light, a tiny, accusing pendulum. Like taking this from Ma's neck after they lowered her into the ground was an accident, like carving threats on a man's door's accident. Her voice trembled, but with fury, not fear. She pointed the locket at Jeb. You wore it, Jeb, like a prize. Is that what Ezekiel is? Your prize reaper? Your firebug? Jeb recoiled as if struck. The sight of the locket, his sister's defiance, the accusation laid bare in the open dawn. It struck a nerve deeper than any bullet. You don't know what you're saying, he blustered, but the certainty in his eyes wavered. Micah's hand was now firmly on his gun. Enough talk, Jeb. Take her. Before Jeb could move, a high, thin wail pierced the air from inside the saddlery. Mama, fire. Tessa's voice, raw with remembered terror. It wasn't directed at them. It was the cry of a child trapped in a waking nightmare triggered by the tension, by the name Ezekiel. At that moment, Ezekiel Holt erupted from the side of the stable, a dark shape against the graying sky. He held a whiskey bottle in one hand, a rag stuffed into its neck, already glistening with coal oil. In his other hand, a lucifer match flared to life, its tiny flame hungry in the dawn gloom. His eyes, wide and frantic, were fixed on the saddler's dry timber wall. Should have signed, Abby, he shrieked, his voice unhinged. Should have signed. He touched the match to the rag. No. Abigail screamed, surging forward. Silas moved faster. He didn't go for Ezekiel. He didn't go for his gun. He swung the heavy iron pry bar in a low, powerful arc. Not a man, but the ground near Micah's feet. It struck the frost-hardened earth with a resounding crack, directly onto a patch of thick, winter-brittle sagebrush hidden beneath a dusting of snow. The impact sent a shock wave through the frozen ground. But more importantly, it struck the dry, resinous sage. A cloud of fine, volatile dust and crushed leaves exploded upwards, propelled by the force of the blow, directly into the path of Ezekiel's rushing form and the flame he held towards the bottle's rag wick. The spark met the dust. A soft warmth filled the air, not an explosion, but a sudden, intense flare of orange flame that engulfed Ezekiel's hand and the bottle's neck. He screamed, a high-pitched sound of pure agony and surprise, dropping the bottle. It shattered on the frozen ground, spilling coal oil that ignited instantly, creating a small, fierce pool of fire at his feet. The flaming rag caught his sleeve. Ezekiel stumbled back, beating frantically at the flames crawling up his arm, his shrieks rending the dawn air. Chaos erupted. Jeb roared, turning towards his shrieking brother, momentarily forgetting Abigail and Silas. Micah, instinctively reacting to the sudden fire and his brother's distress, drew his gun, but his aim was uncertain, swinging between Silas and the chaotic scene with Ezekiel. Abigail didn't hesitate. She saw the open deed box lying just inside the doorway where she'd dropped it. She darted back, snatched the folded parchment, and ran straight towards a small, contained blaze at Ezekiel's feet. Jeb saw her, bellowed, and lunged. Silas stepped into his path, the pry bar held horizontally, blocking him. "Let it go, Jeb." Silas growled, the weight of his own losses, his failures, lending steel to his voice. Or burn with it. Abigail reached the edge of flames. She didn't look at Ezekiel, rolling in the frost trying to smother his burning sleeve. She held the deed to Blackwater Springs, the land, the water, the source of all this blood and grief, over the small inferno of coal oil and sage dust. "This is yours," she cried, her voice ringing with defiance, tears streaking her dusty cheeks. "Take your prize." She dropped the folded parchment into the heart of the fire. The heavy paper caught instantly. Flames leaped, consuming Josiah Holt's signature, the legal language, the dream of cattle empires and toll roads. It curled, blackened, turned to ash in seconds. Jeb Holt watched, frozen, a strangled sound escaping his throat. The deed, the object of his ambition, the reason for the fear and the fire and the threats, dissolved into smoke before his eyes. Micah slowly lowered his gun, his cold eyes wide with disbelief, fixed on the dying flames and the charred remnants. Ezekiel's screams had subsided to agonized whimpers, his arm badly burned. The Reaper's fire turned back on himself. The locket, still clutched in Abigail's hand, felt suddenly cold, insignificant. The power it held was broken. She looked at her brothers, Jeb, hollow-eyed with defeated greed, Micah, stunned and purposeless, Ezekiel, broken and whimpering. The shadows they'd chased were gone, burned away by the dawn and her own courage. Silas lowered the pry bar. The tension bled from his shoulders, replaced by a profound exhaustion and a strange, unfamiliar lightness. He saw Billy's reaching hand, not with guilt this time, but with quiet acknowledgement. This time, I stood. He saw Mary's face, not twisted in fever, but calm, as if whispering, "It's enough." The townsfolk of Sage Bend, drawn by the screams and the fire, were emerging cautiously from doorways, their faces wary in the pale morning light. The sight of the burned deed, the whimpering Ezekiel, and Abigail Holt standing tall amidst the smoke told its own story. Jeb seemed to crumple in on himself. He looked at Abigail, then at the ashes, then at his injured brother. Without a word, he turned, grabbing Micah's arm. "Get Zeke on his horse," he rasped, his voice stripped of all authority. "We're leaving." He couldn't meet Abigail's eyes. The fight was gone, extinguished with the deed. Micah, after a moment's hesitation, holstered his gun and moved to help the moaning Ezekiel. The Reaper coin, forgotten, lay in the frost where Silas had dropped it. Silas stepped back to the doorway. Tess peered out from behind the leather rolls, her eyes huge. Abigail rushed to her, gathering her close, burying her face in the child's hair. Silas stood beside them, a silent sentinel, watching the Holt brothers mount their horses. Jeb didn't look back. Micah guided Ezekiel's horse. They rode out of Sage Bend, not in triumph, but in a shamed, broken silence, back toward the barren plains they'd come from, leaving only the smell of smoke and defeat hanging in the cold air. The rising sun, finally cresting the distant mountains, painted the sky in streaks of rose and gold. It touched the frost on the sagebrush, making it sparkle like scattered diamonds. It warmed the weather with a saddlery, the open doorway where Silas Boone stood beside Abigail Holt and her daughter. Abigail lifted her head, looking at Silas. The fear was gone from her gray eyes, replaced by a weary peace and a question. Tess wriggled free, and held out the small wooden horse toward Silas. "Horsey safe?" she whispered. Silas took the carved horse, its simple form warm from her small hand. He traced its smooth back, the symbol of a lost boy, now a token of found hope. "Yeah, Tess," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Horsey safe." He looked at Abigail. "You both are." Abigail managed a small, tremulous smile. She looked around at the simple, sturdy saddlery, smelling of leather and oil and survival. She looked at the scorch marks on the ground where the deed had burned, the symbol of her past consumed. She looked at Silas, the solitary man who'd fixed a broken strap and, in doing so, had helped mend something broken in her world. "What now?" she asked softly, the question hanging in the clean, cold air of the new day. Silas looked out across the waking town, towards the open plains beyond. The future was uncharted, vast and uncertain as the Wyoming sky. But for the first time in 10 years, the weight in his vest pocket, Mary's watch, felt less like an anchor and more like a quiet, heartbeat-marking time in a world that held possibility again. He placed the wooden horse gently back into Tessa's waiting hands. "Now," Silas Boone said, his gaze meeting Abigail's, a tentative bridge forming between their shared grief and shared strength. "We see what the day brings." He stepped back into the saddlery, leaving the door open wide to the light.